Hello everybody. In today's video we're going to be looking at the reign of King Philip II, or El Rey Felipe II. I have him subtitled as the Mopey Monarch. He was a fairly melancholic guy. He was a deeply devout Catholic who spent his entire life seeking to defend the Catholic Church and to stamp out Protestantism. He had the resources of almost the entire Western Hemisphere at his disposal, and in spite of his constant efforts, he was largely unsuccessful. He's a fairly tragic figure who ruled at the height of Spain's power, and who, in spite of monumental efforts and expenditure of resources, was ultimately a failure. So, anyway, I'm going to tell you his story and talk about how this connects up with the Reformation and world empire and all sorts of other stuff. So I hope you enjoy it. Before we move on, let's take a moment to appreciate his beautiful Habsburg jaw. This was a family characteristic that he shared with his father, the Emperor Charles V, and that would continue to get more and more prominent as members of the Spanish household line continued to intermarry with their cousins and uncles and aunts, to the point where eventually King Charles II of Spain would be a deformed, drooling, and impotent idiot who would represent the final member of the Habsburg line in Spain at the end of the 1600s. But that's a way down the line. Philip II, in spite of his, recessive genes, was highly competent and a fairly effective ruler who maybe just set his sights a little too high. So let's start in 1555. 1555 is a date that you might recognize. This is when the Peace of Augsburg is signed. This is Charles V, the Emperor of Rome, or the Holy Roman Emperor, also the King of Spain, ruler of the New World, recognizes finally that he's not going to be able to stamp out Protestantism in northern Germany, and he recognizes the legitimacy of Lutheranism within the Holy Roman Empire. When this happens, Charles V essentially gives up. He abdicates the throne, and he splits up his sprawling territory. To his brother, he gives Austria and the basket case that is Germany. You can imagine that his brother wasn't necessarily thrilled with this, but that's what happens. To his beloved son, Philip, he gives the best of his territories. He gives Spain. He gives the Low Countries, what is today Netherlands and Belgium, the Burgundy, a very rich agricultural region, large parts of the what will later become Western France, the Duchy of Milan, which was an incredibly prosperous city, the port city of Genoa, southern Italy, and all of Spain's New World territories. You'll also notice that Portugal is shaded in here. This is not controlled by Charles V, but will join with Spain under Philip II in a personal union. So for a little while, Spain and Portugal are going to link up. And so these tan areas are the areas controlled by Philip II, and all of this. The Spanish Empire is at its height during this time period. It's under Philip II that massive silver reserves are going to be tapped both in South America at the mountain of Potosi and in the highlands of central Mexico. And huge quantities of very, very pure silver are going to begin flowing back into Spain. And Philip is going to funnel a large portion of that directly into his war effort to protect and expand Catholicism. It's also very important to note that Spain during this time also controls the Portuguese Empire. So not only do they have money flowing in the form of actual silver dollars from the Spanish territories, but also huge quantities of sugar coming in from coastal Brazil. And they have a monopoly on the route around Africa to control the trade with India. So at this point, Philip II's empire spans the entire globe. It might be the first empire on which the sun never set. Notice the trading ports set up all along the coast of India, as well as along the coast of Africa and the Spice Islands, as they were known at the time. So this gives Philip some incredible strengths as a emperor. He doesn't call himself an emperor, but he rules an empire as the king of Spain. So first of all, he basically has an unlimited quantity of silver, just untold tons and tons of silver pesos coming in yearly shipments to Spanish ports. Also, because of Portugal, he has control of trade with India. So those are two massive strengths. On top of this, Spain also has an incredibly highly trained professional army that employs modern tactics, incorporating gunpowder weapons that basically from the time of Philip II till the end of the 30 Years' War, the Spanish tercio, as the military formation will be known, will remain essentially undefeated in the field. It's possible to beat Spain through naval tactics or defensive fortifications, but if you're going toe-to-toe with a Spanish formation in the field, your odds of winning are very low. Also, on top of this, Spain also has the resources and the incentive to maintain a very powerful navy. So Spain maintains both an Atlantic fleet to control its trade with the New World and India, and also maintains a massive Mediterranean fleet to keep its territories in Italy connected to Spain, and also to protect its territory from Ottoman Turk advances, which we'll see in a moment. So those are the Spanish strengths. Now, there are also a number of very serious weaknesses that Philip II is dealing with, and he's not necessarily going to do a great job. And part of the how I see it is that the strengths that he enjoys are so massive that it's almost can almost forgive him for kind of ignoring some of the weaknesses. If you have a world empire and infinite amounts of silver, maybe that makes up for a lot of these other issues. But these weaknesses are going to come back and get him in the end. So first of all, there's a massive cost of maintaining such a far-flung empire. So Spain is going to be sending officials out throughout the entire world and attempting to maintain law and order in distant, far-flung, undeveloped regions of the world. One of the biggest costs here is corruption. Spanish officials are going to become wildly wealthy by siphoning off some of the wealth being extracted from the New World. So it's estimated that less than half of all of the silver actually mined in the New World actually made it to Spain. The rest ended up in the pockets of people along the way, and huge quantities of it ended up being shipped mostly illegally to China in order to trade for silk and other stuff. And this was all like under the table. So that's one weakness, is corruption and the high costs of actually maintaining this empire. Second, and I think this is really the big one here, is that Spain is going to emphasize totally religious rather than political goals. So Machiavelli would be pulling his hair out here, but Philip II is going to put the resources of his entire empire at the service of the Catholic Church, and he will be willing to make great sacrifices and take huge risks in the service of Catholicism, which these are not going to pay off. Another weakness is Spain's actual economy. So Spain, compared to France or Germany, has a relatively low population, poor agriculture, and pretty pathetic cities. Part of the reason for this is that Spain kicked out a large percentage of its most productive urban citizens when it kicked out the Jews and the Muslims back under the rule of Ferdinand and Isabella. But also, it's partially just Spain's geography. They can't support the same dense populations simply because Spain is a little bit drier. It doesn't have as good of soils as France or Germany or even southern England has. So while Spain has a huge amount of wealth, they don't actually have a very large manufacturing base in Spain or a very large population to draw on for the sake of warfare, manpower reserves. And last of all, there's a fair amount of political and religious dissent within the territories controlled by Philip II. Most importantly, a territory in the Low Countries. So this region right here, probably the second wealthiest part of Europe, except for northern Italy. This is where the Rhine River flows out. It's a center for trade on the European continent. And it is also very close to the northern German princes. So what's going to happen is Protestantism is going to spread and catch on in the Netherlands or in the Low Countries, specifically Calvinism. So it's actually going to come up from Switzerland and then via the printing press and translations catch on in the Netherlands. And this is a huge problem because Philip II needs the Low Countries, especially as a manufacturing and naval base, but he's unwilling to accept Protestantism within his domains. And this is going to lead to probably the costliest war that Philip II fights, which is going to be known as the 80 Years' War, because it lasts 80 years, which is bananas and costs huge amounts of money. And we'll talk about that in a minute. So those are Spain's strengths and weaknesses. And what we're going to see is that basically Philip II's willingness to spend everything on religion is going to squander most of Spain's strengths and untold quantities of silver in an effort to restore unity within Europe, or restore religious unity. So here's Philip II. He had a couple of titles. Also, just take a second to appreciate this get up. So you got to feel like if you had to fight this guy, you'd go for the legs, right? And look at those slippers. I don't get it. But anyway, Philip II wasn't really a fighter. His dad was. Charles V actually would go and lead armies in the field. Philip II was more of a lead bureaucrat. And this earned him the nickname the King of Paper. He was very hardworking, very astute, a prodigious reader, and he would basically wake up in the morning, go to church, eat breakfast, and then lock himself in his room with a bunch of letters from people from all over the world. You know, the vice-regent of New Spain and the vice-regent of all his other places around the world, letters from the Philippines, letters from his generals in the Netherlands, and he would read all of this and he would try to process all of this information and conduct kind of a global grand strategy from his little room at his little desk. And it's cute. I've actually been there, and he's got his huge desk and all his books, and he's got a little framed Albrecht Dürer painting hanging in his room over where he sits. It kind of looks like a college dorm room where you'd sit down and write a term paper. That's where he got that nickname. Trying kind of single-handedly to process this huge quantity of information that's flooding in from all over the world. And by and large, he does a decent job of it. He didn't have the most elaborate bureaucracy. He didn't have a lot of people to read and process this information for him, and he was carrying a very heavy load, and he did it. Second, he also had the title of Defender of the Faith, which makes sense, since he was willing to bleed his country dry for the Catholic Church. And so he definitely deserves that title. So anyway, let's look at the religious wars fought by Philip II. And these are all pretty epic. So we're going to look at three different major conflicts. The first is we're going to look at his battle against the Ottoman Turks to stop the Ottoman Turks from advancing into the Mediterranean. And this is going to be the Battle of Lepanto, and we'll revisit that very soon. Second, we're going to look at the 80 Years' War, in which Philip tries to stamp out Protestantism within the Low Countries, but in fact causes a revolution in which the Netherlands are going to break away from Spain and form an independent Protestant state, and a republic, in fact. They called themselves the Vereinigten Staaten, which is the United States. So actually the first United States is the Netherlands breaking away from Spain back in the mid-1500s, which is cute. And then last of all, he's going to attempt to invade England, and this is going to fail miserably in the famous Spanish Armada. Probably the least important defeat that he suffers, but definitely the most famous in the United States because of our major Anglo bias in looking at European history. So anyway, we'll look at all three of these, and together these represent huge expenditures by Philip II, and he's only going to be successful in one of these. So let's start with the victory. So the Battle of Lepanto is just unbelievably epic. Major naval battles only happen about once a century, but when they do happen, they're earth-shaking. And that's what Lepanto is. It's up there with the Battle of Trafalgar, or oh gosh, what are some other major? There's another really big one, like right here, fought between Caesar and Mark Antony. The name of it's escaping me right now. That might delegitimize me as a historian, but whatever. But the main point is that the Battle of Midway in World War II. The main point is that naval battles are insanely costly and insanely risky. And when two major naval fleets encounter each other, millions and millions of dollars worth of investment can just go up in flames in an afternoon. Whole economies, years of production can just be wiped out. And that's basically what happens in the Battle of Lepanto. And Spain wins here. So here's the deal. The Ottoman Empire had been basically advancing unopposed into Europe. They had been making major advances up the Danube River, kind of like almost every summer sending campaigns out that would push further and further into the heart of Europe, to the point where they were ready to begin laying siege to Vienna, which is the stronghold of the other branch of the Habsburg family. But they were also advancing kind of in a second prong into the Mediterranean. They had conquered Greece. They had conquered North Africa, as you can see down here, and they were beginning to threaten the islands that Spain controlled. So the board was set for a major showdown for naval control of the Mediterranean. And so Spain takes the lead here, partially because they are the most at risk, but also because they view themselves as the defenders of Christendom. And the Ottoman Empire, being a Islamic empire, is viewed as the infidel, and this is viewed as basically a crusade. So Spain takes the lead, but they assemble a kind of coalition fleet calling on Venice and the Papal States, and they get together a huge fleet, and they meet the Turkish fleet off the coast of Greece. It's a very evenly matched evenly matched battle, including hundreds of ships on both sides and thousands of soldiers. Now, this is largely let me back up. Naval warfare during this time period was not what you kind of imagine from like later episodes like Pirates of the Caribbean, where you've got a bunch of cannons lined up on the side of a ship and you like kind of sail around it and shoot at each other. This was galley warfare. Galleys are low, fast, oar-powered ships that basically fight by ramming into the other side or latching on to the other ship and then boarding them and then fighting the other crew in hand-to-hand combat. And this is just brutal. You have soldiers in plate armor in the middle of the ocean duking it out on the decks of flimsy warships. Like these are like, these are almost like missiles that you just aim at other ships and you go. So if you fall off the ship, you just sink to the bottom of the ocean. If your ship is taken, there's basically no surrender. You'll just be like you'll just probably be killed and thrown over the side. So this is just totally brutal fighting. But the Christian fleet led by Spain is victorious. Partially because of new ship designs that do incorporate more gunpowder and cannons into the design that are able to disable a number of Ottoman ships before the two fleets clash. But in the end, it's just a brutal slog. And while Spain does manage to crush the Ottoman fleet, they suffer heavy casualties themselves. And the Mediterranean fleet takes a major drubbing. And it's going to require huge amounts of money to rebuild this fleet in the aftermath. But they are successful, and this represents a major setback for the Ottomans. And they basically are not going to advance any further in the Mediterranean. So this is kind of the first big pushback against the Ottoman advance, which until then had been wildly successful, to the point that some people were talking about leaving Europe behind and just going over to the Americas to set up kind of a new Europe over there, which I think is pretty funny to imagine. So anyway, that's the Battle of Lepanto, and it is a major achievement for Philip II, and allows him to kind of claim, really deserve the title of the Defender of the Faith. He really does win a major victory for all of Christendom. But one thing to think about is that this is kind of a benefit to all of Europe, and Spain is basically footing the bill for it. So France and Germany and everybody benefits from this, but Spain's the one paying for it. So it doesn't really help him out in terms of European power politics. He's kind of taking one for the team. Okay, so second, we've got the revolt in the Netherlands, which lasts, as you can see from the dates here, a little bit more than 80 years. So the Netherlands, first of all, we have to keep in mind that they are crucially important. Because the actual Spanish economy is quite weak, Spain has come to depend on the cities of the Low Countries, Amsterdam, Antwerp, Brussels, Ghent, lots of other places, as kind of the manufacturing and trading hubs of the empire. So even though it's oftentimes Spanish generals commanding Spanish troops, they are oftentimes using guns that were manufactured in the Low Countries. Also, this is a major center for the Spanish Navy and the Atlantic Fleet. And so much of the Spanish fleet is actually constructed here in the Low Countries. So if Spain loses control of this, they're losing a crucial piece of their whole intricate economic system. Now, the people in the Low Countries didn't love their situation. And even before you introduce religion, there was a sort of normal resentment that these guys felt from being part of the Spanish Empire. So the local elites were either Dutch or French-speaking nobles or, guildsmen. And they didn't love that they were being ruled over by a bunch of haughty Spaniards. They also didn't like that they were being taxed and faced with increasing regulation that made sense for Spain, but that didn't actually make sense for the local economies. On top of this, you introduce kind of the really incendiary element of Protestantism, specifically Calvinism. So Calvinism is spreading within the cities, and again, I don't know why, but Calvinism was very popular among urban centers, and so in this highly urbanized area, this is kind of the perfect place for Calvinism to catch on. And what's going to happen is that in some of these Dutch cities, there's going to be an outbreak of violence against Catholic images, because Calvinists do not believe that you should make images of God or religious figures. One of the 10 commandments is thou shalt not make graven images. And statues of Jesus are definitely graven, right? You're like engraving the image into a rock. So the Calvinists, interpreting this literally, begin going around and destroying church art. this, you probably couldn't have done anything to bother Philip II more, who was both a devout Catholic and a lover of art. And so he decided to crush this revolt with an iron fist. So he sends his boy, the Duke of Alba, in to just totally root out these Calvinist rebels. The Duke of Alba is not a great politician, and he basically, going after a small radical minority, uses such violent tactics that he angers the entire the entire population of the Low Countries with his brutal tactics. Just kind of like arresting and torturing and executing people just because they were suspected of possibly being associated with these groups. So this leads to a revolt, and the nobles, the Protestant nobles, who were concentrated mostly in the north of the Netherlands, basically unify under a military leader, a guy named William of Orange, and they proceed to declare independence from Spain and launch a military revolt against Spain in the name of independence and Protestantism. So this war goes on for a long time, and it, except for a period in 1609 where a 12-year truce occurs, they're basically slugging it out from the late 1560s all the way until 1648, which is also the end of the 30 Years' War. So it's just a brutal, long drawn-out kind of stalemate that drains Spanish resources. So one thing that's kind of fun to talk about. I'll go into a little bit more details. So how is it that the Netherlands, let me find it. The Netherlands, which is this little pink area right here, how is it that this tiny little region is able to go up against a global empire for 80 years and eventually win their independence? Well, here's the deal. The Dutch are able to seize a large portion of the Spanish Atlantic fleet. That means they gain naval superiority over their coastline, and they are free to attack and raid Spanish holdings around the world. So this is a huge problem for Spain, because if you're Spain, how do you actually get to the Netherlands now? Well, so if you load troops up onto ships and then try to invade the Netherlands this way, the odds are is you will be discovered by Dutch patrols, and your troop transports will be sunk, and you will lose not just a fleet, but also an army. So instead, here's what you have to do. You have to load troops up on your busted galleys, the ones that you have left after the Battle of Lepanto, sail them over to Genoa, which they actually control. From Genoa, march them up through Milan, then march them through Switzerland, then march them through Germany to here. This whole process might take 6 months to get a single pikeman from Spain to the Netherlands. And then once you're there, guess what the Dutch have done? They have constructed a ring of fortifications that basically go all the way around their territories. And so as soon as you get to Dutch territory, your exhausted dudes who have just walked from Italy to the Netherlands have to surround and take each one of these Dutch fortresses that can be resupplied from the Dutch interior. Meanwhile, the Dutch can raid your coastline and pirate your shipping and steal Spanish silver to use that money to continue to fund the war effort. So this is a brutal drain on Spanish resources. And the Dutch are so effective at defending themselves that they actually seem to grow stronger as the war continues, as they continue to seize Spanish territory and pirate Spanish silver. Thanks to their dominance of the Atlantic Ocean. So this is a total debacle. It's kind of like the Vietnam War for Spain. There's no way for them to win, but they don't want to back down. So rather they just dump huge quantities of silver into this kind of dead-end war effort. Now, while that is all going on, they also end up going to war with England. So Philip II didn't want to go to war with England. In fact, he wanted to marry the Queen of England. And he actually succeeded in doing this when Mary I, Mary Tudor, who was Catholic, married him And they were married from 1554 to 1558, which led to a personal union of England and Spain. And Mary actually brought England back into the Catholic Church for 4 years. But Mary was a rather sickly person, and she died young of a random fever. Philip II, he got over it, and he quickly proposed marriage to Mary's younger sister, who became the next Queen of England, Elizabeth I. However, Elizabeth I was a Protestant, and maybe not super into Philip's Habsburg jaw, and she turned Philip down and began to reconvert England back to Protestantism. So Philip now has a religious reason and possibly also a personal reason to try and take out England. So while his war is going on with the Netherlands, he decides that he's going to attempt to invade England. In spite of the fact that the Dutch are also already giving him huge problems in the Atlantic Ocean, he's going to give it a shot anyway. On top of this, the English are also definitely provoking Spain. Elizabeth I has been licensing pirates, aka legal pirates, aka privateers, to begin attacking and raiding Spanish silver shipments, which is becoming a major pain for Spain. And the English are also thinking about setting up colonies in the New World, which could potentially represent a rival to the Spanish control of the Americas. So these are all reasons why Spain should maybe think about taking out England. Oh, also England has been supporting the Dutch rebels. So anyway, Philip decides he's had enough and that he's going to attempt to invade England. Now, the problem here is he's lost most of his Atlantic navy to the Dutch. So what he does is he brings the remnants of his Mediterranean fleet, these long, narrow galleys that are designed to sail on the relatively calm Mediterranean into the rough and stormy Atlantic. And this is going to be a huge catastrophe. These galleys are not designed to fight in the choppy Atlantic waters. So when the Armada sets out, it's a huge invasion force. Not only does it have warships, but it also has troop transports. They're planning on launching an amphibious invasion of England and just conquering the country. So the Armada is laid low, partially by the valiant defense put up by the English Navy, led by Sir Francis Drake. And they are able basically to sail circles around the Spanish fleet because their boats are actually designed for the Atlantic. And they also are making heavy use of cannons to engage the Spanish at long range, whereas the galleys are trying to get up into close combat. But the fleets eventually disengage. And what really wrecks the Spanish Armada is just a total blunder. They decide to sail back around. They decide to basically sail around Scotland to get back to Spain, and they get wrecked by an early winter storm. And most of the fleet just ends up sinking off the coast of Scotland. Very few of the ships actually make it back. So anyway, this is brutal. And all of these costly defeats and costly victories all kind of lead up to kind of the beginning of the decline of the Spanish Empire. There are some successes. First of all, they do manage to kind of halt the Ottoman expanse, although the Ottomans will remain a major power in the Mediterranean and a major rival to Spanish presence for a long time. They'll outlast the Spanish as a major power for sure. However, the main objective of Philip II to reunite Christendom and to stamp out Protestantism is a total failure. The war in the Netherlands is still raging by the time Philip dies. England is an independent power. And so the northern German princes are still doing their thing. So Philip II, his greatest life ambition is a failure. On top of this, he was willing to devote huge quantities of silver to these exploits. And this results in the decline of the Spanish economy. So first of all, Spain is importing so much silver that this is leading to massive inflation in Spain itself, because the Spanish economy isn't actually growing. So there's just a ton of silver floating around, but not actually that much many goods being produced. So the price of goods in Spain begins to skyrocket. They also lose control of the Netherlands, which means they lose control of their main manufacturing base, which means they have to pay other people to make their stuff. So that means that a lot of Spanish silver ends up just going to other countries, or going into like Genoa and Milan, for example. And they actually managed to go bankrupt several times in spite of the huge amounts of silver that they're importing. That's how much money they're spending on these wars. Also, this means that Spain's rivals are going to begin to rise up relatively to Spain. So England is going to begin to emerge as a major naval power and a major mercantile power in the Atlantic. Holland is going to begin to emerge as the economic center of Northern Europe. And France is going to emerge as the major continental power after they deal with their own wars of religion. So basically, Spain is squandering all of its strength on these religious wars, while all of Spain's rivals are centralizing power, building up their own economies, and getting ready to take on Spain in the continual power politics of the European continent. So basically, Spain is going to remain a major power for a while, but this is kind of the beginning of the decline. And if Philip II had maybe pursued political Machiavellian goals rather than religious goals, if he had invested in his own economy, if he had fought wars that he could win, it's possible that Spain might have remained a major power on the world stage for much longer. But instead, the Spanish Empire is going to begin to crumble, and by the 1700s, it's going to collapse, and the Habsburg dynasty will die out and be replaced by the Bourbon dynasty. So anyway, that's kind of the end of the story for Philip II.